Bonnie and Clyde are perhaps the most romanticized outlaws of all time. You already know that certain foods are bad for your waistline and heart, but recent research confirms that junk food and other culprits may up your risk for cancer, too. Here's what you need to know. Food for thought. There are plenty of reasons to improve the quality of your diet, but researchers have recently confirmed that lowering your risk of developing certain types of cancer may be the best reason of all. Eating processed foods high in sugar, fat, and sodium puts you at higher risk of obesity and related conditions such as diabetes and heart disease. At a time when gangsters and bad guys were celebrities, they stood out. No one knows who Al Capone's or John Dillinger's lady friends were off the top of their heads. The fact that Bonnie and Clyde committed crimes as a couple made them special. Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker met in 1930, and later went on a 21-month spree. And now a study published in the journal PLOS Medicine finds a link between a nutrition-poor diet and an increased risk of many types of cancers. The researchers relied on a UK once they got started. They toured across various southern states, leaving death and destruction in their wake. Nutritional labeling system known as the Nutri-Score logo, which has been in use since 2007, to evaluate the diets of more than 470,000 adults. Even after correcting for other factors such as exercise habits and smoking, they found that adults whose diets featured foods with the poorest scores had the highest risk of stomach, colorectal, and respiratory tract cancers, as well as lung cancer for men and liver and postmenopausal breast cancer for women. Check out 30 foods proven to help prevent cancer. See Gallery. Don't fear food. The study doesn't indicate that an occasional drive-through dinner is going to kill you. Experts say that the problem is with a diet that's consistently poor. If you're not regularly eating lean protein, whole grains, and fruits and vegetables and instead eating a diet heavy on fat, sugar, sodium, and processed foods, it's time to reevaluate. Here are the types of food that experts say you'll want to cut back on to lower your risk of cancer. Related, celebs who have battled breast cancer or have breast cancer. See Gallery. More from Reader's Digest. This common skin condition could raise your risk for Alzheimer's disease. 7 silent signs of a heart attack. The one negative of apple cider vinegar. No one talks about videos going viral right now. Yet the public was obsessed with them. This sexy young couple taking on the police and the banks, two of the most hated institutions in Prohibition and Great Depression-era America. But of course, there's more to the story. Bonnie and Clyde were real people, with complicated and tragic pasts. Their love affair was more than a little twisted. And their crime spree wasn't as impressive as it's gone down in legend. Here's the things the movies don't tell you. Bonnie and Clyde could have been famous by more traditional means. While Bonnie and Clyde ended up becoming famous by killing people and robbing banks, they probably could have taken the legal route. Both were talented in more traditional ways. According to Bonnie and Clyde's hideout, Clyde had a natural music ability. His brother-in-law taught him to play the saxophone, and he also played guitar. It's said he brought a little happiness into the lives of others sentenced to poverty when he'd strum the guitar around the fire at camps the couple stayed at while on the run. When one of their safehouses was raided, Clyde's guitar was left behind, and he asked his mother to try and get it back to him. She failed, but he did manage to hold onto his sax. It was actually in the car, along with sheet music, when he and Bonnie were killed. Bonnie was the one who actively wanted to be famous, though. The producers and writer of 2 different movies about Bonnie and Clyde all said she wanted to be a celebrity by any means necessary, whether it was as a Broadway star, a singer, a Hollywood actress, or even a poet. And she did have talent. Growing up she starred in school plays and pageants, including one where Texas Monthly reports that a boy upstaged her, so she punched him. When the audience broke into applause, she cartwheeled across the stage. Once she became famous for her life of crime, she referred to their fans as her public and signed autographs. Bonnie was married, but not to Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde are up there with Romeo and Juliet when it comes to famous and extremely dysfunctional romantic relationships, but Bonnie had found love long before meeting Clyde. She met and married Roy Thornton in 1926, and they never divorced. According to Texas History Notebook, Roy was blessed with naturally good looks. Bonnie certainly had a type. While he's sometimes referred to as a welder, Roy was a hardened criminal. They met when Bonnie was just 15, and a year later she dropped out of school to marry him. Even back then people made stupid tattoo decisions, and Bonnie got her and Roy's names inked in hearts above her knee, reports Bonnie and Clyde's hideout. Roy would disappear for long stretches, committing crimes and seeing other women. Bonnie probably knew about the cheating, writing in her diary that she had a roaming husband with a roaming mind. After he left for the third time in less than a year, she was pretty over it. She wrote that while she loved him very much and missed him terribly, this time she was not going to take him back. Bonnie said she was swearing off guys, adding, "Let all men go to hell." Almost 2 years to the day after she wrote that, she met Clyde and it was love at first sight. But she wore Roy's wedding ring until the day she died. Her first husband only outlived her by 4 years, shot to death in a prison break. Prison completely changed Clyde. Clyde's initial brushes with the law were very minor. His first arrest was for failing to return a rental car on time, and his second was for stealing a turkey. But his crimes started escalating. Finally, at 21 years old he was sent to prison for burglary, according to the FBI. Eastham Prison Farm was no joke. Even at a time when all prisons were horrific for the people inside, Texas Monthly says Eastham was the worst of the worst. Prisoners were regularly beaten by guards or had their hands cuffed to a pipe over their heads for a whole day, and there was even a guard who would execute prisoners point blank and then say they died trying to escape. Clyde's experience at Eastham was so bad that he never talked to anyone about it, not even the love of his life. But we do know some of the things that happened to him there. An inmate known as Big Ed Crowder beat him and sexually assaulted him repeatedly. Clyde finally couldn't take the abuse anymore, and one night he got Big Ed alone in the bathroom and beat him to death with a pipe. An inmate already serving life took the rap, and Clyde was eventually paroled. His good friend said prison changed Clyde from a schoolboy to a rattlesnake. Even before he got out, Clyde started formulating a plan. He was going to start a gang, steal money and guns, then return to Eastham and kill all the guards. Bonnie's time in jail changed her, too. While Clyde was the hardened criminal of the pair, Bonnie was still committing crimes by being his accomplice, and eventually, the law caught up with her. In March 1932, she was present at a botched robbery, according to PBS. Clyde managed to get away, but Bonnie was captured and put in a Texas jail until her case went before a grand jury. Clyde's trip to prison involved backbreaking hard labor and sexual assault. Bonnie's was nothing like that, but the months in lockup still changed her. While inside, Bonnie wrote poetry, using gangster lingo that she mostly got from trashy novels and the movies. But it seemed to show that she was into the criminal lifestyle with Clyde 100%. When Bonnie's mother read the poems, she began to see a strange and terrifying change in the mind of her child. The poems indicated that nothing was going to tear Bonnie away from Clyde, even if you can read between the lines and see that she blamed him for the fact she was in jail. Meanwhile, the Texas State Historical Association records that in April, Clyde killed a man. It wasn't until June that the grand jury met and decided there was no way a woman would participate in a crime voluntarily. Since Bonnie must have been under some kind of duress, they no-billed her, and she was released. Then she proved them wrong by voluntarily rejoining Clyde and his gang of criminals within weeks. Bonnie's poetry is an insight into her mind. It wasn't just all the free time in jail that inspired Bonnie to pen some poems. It was a habit she kept up even in between committing crimes, and some of those poems still exist today. They are a fascinating insight into what she thought about her lifestyle and her partner. The story of Suicide Sal, which was written from prison in 1932, is framed as a story she'd been told while in the joint by another inmate, the beautiful Sal. But you be forgiven for thinking Sal had more than a little Bonnie in her, since she's described as a good girl who fell in with a professional killer that she loved and ran around with for a year. About the time Bonnie and Clyde had been together at that point, and he taught her all about the underworld. Then she ends up in prison after a botched robbery while her partner got away. So, art imitating life there. Sal goes on to get out of jail and kill the guy, so maybe Bonnie was a bit angry with Clyde at that point. But the most famous of her poems is the 1934 one now known as The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, in which she compares them to Jesse James and says it was the law being unfair to Clyde that put them on their path. It's also clearly spelled out that she knew they were going to die together. Both Bonnie and Clyde had trouble walking. Oddly, by the time they died, both Bonnie and Clyde would suffer injuries that made it difficult for them to walk. Clyde's issue was a result of his time in prison. The torture he went through at Eastham also included hard labor, according to New World Encyclopedia. Desperate to avoid the backbreaking work and hoping for a transfer to a less terrifying environment, Clyde asked another prisoner to chop off some of his toes with an axe. It wasn't his tiny, less important toes, either. Vintage News says Clyde lost the big toe and most of the second toe on his left foot. This had a lasting impact on his ability to walk, and he had to drive in his stocking feet from then on. It was also pointless. By the time he lost his little piggies, the parole board had already agreed to release him. Clyde left Eastham 6 days after mutilating himself. Bonnie had less choice when it came to her injury. In June 1933, the two were on the run when Clyde badly crashed their car. Clyde was fine, but Bonnie got battery acid all over her right leg. It ate away down to the bone in some areas. Despite the seriousness, the outlaw obviously couldn't just show up at a hospital, and thought reports that Bonnie was nursed by Clyde and other members of the gang. They must not have done a great job because she never walked properly again. Bonnie and Clyde became famous because of misleading pictures. It wouldn't be wrong to call Bonnie and Clyde the first American reality stars. The public followed their exploits for 2 years, and history says everyone romanticized what were actually pretty horrific crimes because they were committed by a young, beautiful couple in love. The fact they weren't married made it even more risque. It was perfect tabloid fodder, except it was also front-page news of legitimate newspapers. According to Smithsonian Magazine, the biggest reason Bonnie and Clyde became so famous was the discovery of some cute photos they took. It was actually just some rolls of undeveloped film that the police discovered at a safe house they raided. But the cops processed the pictures, a local newspaper ran them, and then they sent them over the wires. It was this technology, the ability for the ends of the earth to get images of Bonnie and Clyde adorably playing around, that made them major celebrities. The public loved the pictures. They showed the couple larking about with each other. There Bonnie pretended to shoot Clyde, there she was on his shoulders, and, most famous of all, there she was with a cigar between her teeth, Freudian implications and all, and a pistol in her hand, looking like the perfect gun moll. This would be how the public imagined Bonnie, although she didn't normally handle guns and she smoked cigarettes, not cigars. Thanks to those photos, they went from local Texas outlaws to criminal superstars. Bonnie had the fame she always wanted. Bonnie and Clyde didn't kill a lot of people. Various members of the Barrow Gang killed plenty of people. Clyde is thought to have murdered 10 personally, according to New World Encyclopedia. If anyone blocked their escape, they would die, even if they were innocent bystanders. But they had a lot of chances to kill people it might have made more sense for them to kill, and they didn't take them. Instead, Bonnie and Clyde seemed to enjoy kidnapping people and traveling around with them for a bit. It didn't matter if they were civilians or police officers. The podcast Stuff You Missed in History class recalls one time when a cop tried to pull the outlaws over for speeding, so they just took him. Another kidnapped officer asked Bonnie if there was anything she wanted him to tell the press when he got released. She said to tell them she didn't really smoke cigars. On some occasions, the couple would give their kidnapping victims money to get back home. The fact that they didn't kill everyone might have been one of the reasons the public loved Bonnie and Clyde. But a single mistake turned the tide. 2 policemen came up to their car one morning. For one of the cops, it was his first day on the job and he was about to get married. Clyde wanted to kidnap them like usual, but his cry of "Let's take them" was misunderstood by a gang member who started shooting. After those murders, public opinion turned against the couple. Bonnie and Clyde's infamous robberies were unimpressive. The duo and their gang became famous for robbing banks. They stole nice cars, and the pictures that circulated showed them wearing fancy clothes, so as former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives Jim Wright recalled from his childhood via 405 magazine, "You had to envy them a little, being so rich and happy." In reality, their infamous robberies were unimpressive. The gang lived hand to mouth, and one of the reasons they kept holding places up was they never got much money out of it. The Encyclopaedia Britannica says they never took more than $1,500, and once got as little as $80. They were so desperate for cash, sometimes they would break into vending machines for food money. They robbed fewer than 15 banks during their 21-month crime spree, and since it was the Great Depression, things didn't always go as planned. Bonnie and Clyde's hideout records that one of the gang attempted to rob the Ponder State Bank in Texas, only to be told it had failed a week earlier and there was no money to steal. Clyde apparently thought this was hilarious when he was told. But the fact it was the Depression and everyone was barely getting by made Bonnie and Clyde's usual choice of victim extremely disappointing. They knew there was less chance of being caught if they robbed small-town restaurants, grocery stores, and gas stations, so those were the places they normally hit, meaning they weren't hurting the man so much as the little guy. Clyde's mom was a classic enabler. Bonnie might be the famous woman in Clyde's life, but there was another equally important one. Kumi Barrow, Clyde's mom, was fundamental in enabling his life of crime. According to history, after Bonnie and Clyde were killed, the U.S. government put a bunch of their family members on trial for aiding the outlaws. In his closing arguments, the prosecutor roared that Kumi was the real mastermind of the conspiracy. Kumi certainly was more than just a mother who loved her son even though he went bad. When Clyde first went to prison, authorities tried to pin a murder on him. But his mommy gave a newspaper interview where she swore Clyde was with her in a different city when the murder occurred. In order to make her son look like a mere boy, she said he only just turned 18. He was really 21. She tried to get him out of jail by claiming to be a widow, her husband was very much alive, who needed her son to support her. The parole board eventually made their decision to release Clyde early specifically because of these lies. Once Bonnie and Clyde started their crime spree, Kumi let them visit her dozens of times. She bought them nice clothes and probably bribed cops. And she kept giving weepy interviews, denying she knew Bonnie and claiming Clyde was completely innocent. When it came time for her own sentencing, she managed to cry her way into just a month behind bars. Bonnie and Clyde syndrome explains women attracted to evil men. Bonnie and Clyde's names might go together, but they were not equally violent. Not by a long shot. Eyewitness reports say Bonnie never wielded a gun, always waited in the car when they were holding up banks, encouraged kidnapping over murder, and almost certainly never killed anyone herself. Texas Monthly says before turning to a life of crime, Bonnie was bright, popular, and famously tender-hearted, doing sweet things like breaking her pencil in half to share with students who couldn't afford one. So what the heck was she doing with a psychopath like Clyde? Or for that matter, her chronically criminal husband? Bonnie was probably attracted to violent men because she suffered from hybristophilia. According to Psychology Today, hybristophiliacs, usually women, find it pleasurable when their partner commits an outrage or crime, such as rape, murder, or armed robbery. Roy Thornton fit the bill, but if worse crimes mean a bigger turn-on, then Clyde was the one who really must have done it for her. The couple were definitely passionate. And Bonnie is such the perfect archetype of someone with hybristophilia that it's often called Bonnie and Clyde syndrome. You still see people, again, usually women for some reason, who have this today. It's the reason serial killers, even the ugly ones, find themselves with lots of female admirers and fan mail. Part of the attraction may be the more violent their mate becomes, the more special they are, since he would never hurt them. Chances to go straight. According to Blanche Barrow in her book My Life with Bonnie and Clyde, there was a point when her brother-in-law wanted to go straight. After Clyde was paroled from Eastham prison, he worked at his parents' service station and even left Texas for a job in Massachusetts to try and escape his criminal past. But it didn't last. The Barrow and Parker families didn't give up, though. Buck Barrow was paroled from prison on March 22, 1933, and within days, there was a family reunion of sorts in Joplin, Missouri. Buck and Blanche met up with Bonnie and Clyde along with W. D. Jones, and the consensus seems to be that Buck's goal was to get Clyde to surrender. However, the National Park Service says that if this was the case, he had little chance of success. The group lived together in an apartment for 12 days, laying low, drinking, and acting almost normal. Of course, that couldn't last, and the reunion ended with a shootout with police after neighbors reported the group for being too loud. In July, Buck and Blanche were captured by police. Buck, who'd been shot 7 times that month, died 5 days later. But in May, the gang had met up with Bonnie's mom, The Strange History of Bonnie and Clyde Records. Now it was Emma Parker's turn to try to get her daughter to surrender, telling Bonnie she'd only get a prison sentence, not the death penalty. Again, the pleas fell on deaf ears. Other members of the Barrow gang, Bonnie and Clyde, are often mentioned in conjunction with their gang, but according to Heart of Texas Tales, it was only a gang in the very loosest sense. The 8 male members were never together as one cohesive group, instead committing crimes in 2s or 3s over time. Bonnie Parker was the only regular female member, although Blanche Barrow, married to Clyde's brother Buck, was with the group for a period. The various people who could lay claim to being part of the Barrow gang saw very different ends. Bonnie and Clyde were shot to death in an ambush. Buck Barrow died of pneumonia after surgery, although all the bullet wounds sustained in shootouts with police helped. His wife would serve 6 years in prison and live until 1988. Find a Grave says that Raymond Hamilton was public enemy number 1 from 1934–35 and would be sentenced to 362 years in prison. However, he would, in fact, eventually receive the death penalty. W. D. Jones was caught and sentenced to 15 years but only served 6. In 1968, he told the story of his time with Bonnie and Clyde to Playboy. He died violently in 1974, shot during an altercation. The last survivor of the gang was Ralph Fultz, whom the AP reports began his criminal career at 14 before falling in with Bonnie and Clyde. He spent 9 years in prison before turning his life around. He died of cancer in 1993, age 82. They knew one of the people who embalmed them. Bonnie and Clyde absolutely knew how their end was going to come. If they turned themselves in, they would get the electric chair, and if they were caught, whoever found them was going to shoot to kill. So they just kept running around doing crimes, waiting for the inevitable violent end. One of their crimes in 1933 was stealing a fancy new Ford. Except this time the owner saw them and wasn't about to let thieves take his car that easily. According to Digital Dying, H. Diller Darby didn't know who the bad guys were, or he might have thought twice. But he got in another car with a female friend to chase them down. The foolhardy attempt ended with the pair kidnapped by the outlaws. Bonnie apparently saved their lives, saying there was no point in killing them. While driving their new captives around before releasing them, Bonnie chatted with Darby and thought it was hilarious that he was an undertaker. She joked that maybe he'd work on her and Clyde soon. Less than a year later, he actually would. After Bonnie and Clyde were killed, Vintage News says that Darby and the other undertaker working on their bodies had problems embalming them because of all the bullet holes. The fluid kept running right back out. Bonnie and Clyde's violent end. Bonnie and Clyde were very good at staying one step ahead of the law, but they knew their end was inevitable. As their violent crimes racked up and public opinion turned against them, the law was slowly closing in. The groups came together in a hail of gunfire on May 23, 1934, in Black Lake, Louisiana. In April, the FBI records that one of their agents learned that Bonnie and Clyde had been visiting that area of the state, specifically the home of gang member Henry Methvin. The big break came in May, when the FBI discovered Bonnie and Clyde had been there for a party on the 21st and were planning on returning again in 2 days. Lawmen from Louisiana and Texas worked together to set up an ambush on the side of the road. When Bonnie and Clyde drove by, they planned to start shooting. This meant one of the people there needed to know the criminal couple on site. Deputy Ted Hinton had been an acquaintance of Bonnie's in Dallas, where he was a regular at the cafe where she waitressed, according to the Vintage News. In the book he wrote years later, Ambush, he admitted he'd always liked Bonnie. The Texas State Historical Association says that as their car drove past the hidden lawman that morning, Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down with over 160 bullets. They died instantly. Bonnie was holding a sandwich, cigarettes, and a machine gun. Clyde was clutching a revolver. Their afterlife was just as crazy. Dying didn't tone down the craziness around Bonnie and Clyde. Within 24 hours, the population of the nearest town swelled from 2,000 to 12,000 people. As the death car with their bodies inside was hauled to the morgue, trophy hunters reached in to grab things, either off the car or off Bonnie and Clyde themselves. According to Vintage News, these included locks of hair and pieces of bloody clothing. There was even a man who tried to cut off Clyde's finger, and another who took a knife to his ear. But one guy wanted Clyde's whole body. Texas Escapes reports a huckster offered his parents $50,000, yes, during the Great Depression, to mummify Clyde's body and make it part of a traveling show. They refused, but when the stolen death car was returned, its owner put it on tour. You can still take selfies with it today. The outlaws' bodies returned to Dallas, where Texas History Notebook says they were put on public display at 2 mortuaries. Around 10,000 people came to look at Clyde, while 20,000 wanted to see Bonnie. Their funerals were much smaller, a couple hundred people each, but only because there were lots of armed guards. Bonnie and Clyde had asked to be buried next to each other, but Bonnie's mother wouldn't hear of it. They were laid to rest in Dallas cemeteries a couple miles apart. D Magazine reports that as of 2019, the families are considering changing their minds and the couple might be reunited at last. The modern obsession with anything connected to Bonnie and Clyde you'd be forgiven for thinking Bonnie and Clyde were just swell, because modern America is still as obsessed with them as it was during their lifetimes. Clyde was, of course, a vicious murderer, and Bonnie was his willing accomplice. But it seems anything connected with them is fair game to stick in a museum or make a buck off of. Roadside America lists no fewer than 35 locations connected to the criminals on their Bonnie and Clyde Bloody Adventure Trail. While some are a bit more obscure, the Bonnie and Clyde death car pictured, now located in a casino in Primm, Nevada, routinely registers among RoadsideAmerica.com's most popular attractions. And yes, that is the actual car the pair actually died in, complete with bullet holes. If you want more than just a look, the Missourian reports that as of 2019, you can stay in the Joplin apartment the gang hid out in for almost 2 weeks, because it's now an Airbnb. But not everyone wants to honor Bonnie and Clyde. In 2020, the Dallas Morning News reported that the current owner of the service station owned by Clyde Barrow's father wanted to tear the old building down because he'd have felt gross about making a memorial to a couple that murdered multiple people. A good point, well made. The West Dallas Landmark Commission disagreed and started the process to make the building an official landmark, over the owner's objections. Bonnie and Clyde in pop culture. Bonnie and Clyde wanted to be famous, and they got their wish, appearing in pop culture over and over again to this day. But it started only shortly after their death. In 1937, The Atlantic says, a little-known classic of American literature, Edward Anderson's Thieves Like Us, retold a fictionalized version of the Bonnie and Clyde story. The book would inspire 3 movies in the next 3 decades. Another film, Gun Crazy, told a different version of the story in 1949. It was remade with Drew Barrymore in 1992, as did 1958's The Bonnie Parker Story. There have been numerous miniseries and TV movies made about the pair's life, not to mention, as the BBC notes, countless books, paintings and other artworks. In 2011, Bonnie and Clyde came to Broadway in a musical, although this was far from the first music they inspired. Everyone from Eminem to Scarlett Johansson have written songs about the pair. The most famous is probably Beyoncé and Jay-Z's 2002 collaboration, '03 Bonnie and Clyde. The pinnacle of Bonnie and Clyde in pop culture, however, is still the 1967 movie starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway pictured. The BBC says the final scene, their bloody death at the hands of lawmen, which comes out of nowhere and then cuts to black, changed Hollywood. While reviews were mixed at the time, Bonnie and Clyde the film would go on to influence cinema for decades, just like the real Bonnie and Clyde.